24th of February 2022. It's a date about which children will learn decades from now, because that's when the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. At the start of the war, we all thought this is going to end quickly, that Ukraine will get crushed by the Russian army. But this didn't happen. The Ukrainian might and the Russian incompetence fueled this conflict to last even more. And here we are, 6 months later, and the war is still ongoing, and it will not end anytime soon. Today, I'll explain why. First, let's see why the war started. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, most of the ex-Soviet satellite states kept close ties with one another. Ukraine remained in the Russian sphere of influence, but in the meanwhile grew closer relations with the EU and the West. After the pro-Russian president Yanukovych decided not to sign the EU association agreement in favor of closer economic integration with Russia, the Euromaidan started. It was a series of pro-EU protests in Ukraine that lasted for months and eventually ousted the president. But there were some people in Ukraine, especially the ethnic Russians in the south and east of the country, that protested the government change. The Ukrainian authorities responded by cracking down on the pro-Russian protests, and Russia responded by occupying Crimea and then annexing it, and arming separatists in the Donbas region. The conflict quickly escalated in 2014 into a war between the Ukrainian army and the separatist states of Donetsk and Luhansk, backed by Russian forces. After a year of fighting in the east, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire in 2015, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict remained frozen for 7 years, until 2020. In 2021, a year before the start of the invasion, Russia started a massive military build-up at the border with Ukraine, but the officials denied any military involvement. Before the start of the war, Russia accused the Ukrainian government of Russophobia, with Putin saying that they are making the first steps towards genocide. He also made other claims about the government of Ukraine, saying it's controlled by neo-Nazis, even though President Zelensky is himself Jewish. Then Russia started making demands that Ukraine will never be a part of NATO, and that NATO will withdraw its forces from the members in Eastern Europe, and threatened a military response if NATO continues this aggressive policy of literally protecting its member states. In the days leading to the war, Russia recognized the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. The fighting in Donbas resumed, and the two sides accused each other of breaking the ceasefire. After the fight started, Russia sent what they called a peacekeeping mission, and on 24th of February 2022, Putin held a speech that announced a special military operation in Ukraine. He supported it by saying the invasion's goal is to protect Russian speakers in Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky responded by declaring martial law and ordering a general mobilization of all Ukrainian men between 18 and 60 years old. The war had begun. Ukraine was attacked from three sides. From the east to conquer the Donbas region, from the north from Russia as well as from Belarus, with the offensive's goal to take over Kyiv, and from the south from Crimea to take the coastline. On the northern front, the Russian troops attacked from Belarus, along the west side of the Dnieper River, taking over Chernobyl and then stopping northwest of Kyiv, while another spearhead offensive started from Russia and then stopped northwest of Kyiv. Russia planned to rapidly encircle Kyiv from the east as well as the west. In the west, advances were slowed by the Ukrainian army, but Russian troops still managed to make some progress. In the east, the offensive was completely stopped, since a big part of the forces were left behind, sieging Chernihiv. On 16 March, Ukraine started a very successful counter-offensive to repel the Russian forces, and Ukraine recaptured the region surrounding Kyiv. Russian forces passed the North Crimean Canal and then started two offensives along the coastline. One towards Mariupol to connect with the separatists in Donbas, and the other towards Odessa to link up with the Russian-controlled separatist region of Moldova, Transnistria. They made some gains in the south, but they didn't take the city of Mariupol, which was under siege for 3 months. Even after the city was encircled, the Ukrainians refused to surrender and fought furiously. Mariupol was heavily bombed by the Russian Air Force, resulting in most of the city being destroyed and more than 2,500 dying. On the eastern front, the goal was to take over the entirety of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, as well as other major cities in the east. The Russians made offensives in the oblasts, and they attacked Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, but the Ukrainian troops defended the city. After a humiliating Russian defeat in the siege of Kyiv, Putin completely pulled out of northern Ukraine, and decided to focus on the southeastern front. All of the troops united under the leadership of Alexander Durnikov in the operation called the Eastern Assault. After the redeployment of the forces in the north, Russia focused on the offensive in Donbas. The siege of Mariupol was eventually won by the Russians, and they attacked the city of Severodonetsk, the largest city in Luhansk under Ukrainian control. After intense artillery fire, the Ukrainians retreated, and Russian forces took over the city. Ukrainian troops tried a counterattack, but after retaking about 20% of the city, they were pushed out. After Russia took Severodonetsk, they continued the offensive in the southwest by bombing the cities of Mykolaiv and Odessa, which have strategic importance in the region, being the most important shipping centers in the Black Sea that Ukraine still controls. After the bombings, the UN made a deal to create a corridor for the shipping of grain and other foods from Ukraine. In the offensive, Russia also took control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and installed heavy artillery and mobile missile launchers. Specialists warned that an attack on the nuclear plant could cause a nuclear disaster just as, if not bigger than Chernobyl. An attack was however made by somebody, but with no serious consequences. In August, Ukrainians started to fight in Crimea, with explosions in both western as well as northeastern Crimea. Meanwhile, the Russian airstrikes are also going on, mostly attacking military targets, but also some civilian ones, like the Kremenchuk shopping mall attack, which killed at least 20 and injured at least 56 people. The attack was condemned by the international community and called a war crime by French President Emmanuel Macron. But even after the bombings, the Russians still don't have air superiority. While Russia surpasses Ukraine in both quantity and quality of combat aircraft, Ukraine makes up for it in ground-based anti-aircraft capabilities. Overall, the second phase of the war was not a complete failure, but also not a success. The Russians made some small slow advances at the start of the eastern offensive, but right now the front came to a stalemate. There are two main reasons why Russia is losing this war: the Russian army's incompetence and the foreign aid provided to Ukraine. Let's start with the military aid given to Ukraine. Ukraine has received a lot of equipment and money from the US and the EU, with the US giving $350 million and the EU giving $500 million just in the first week of the war. Ukraine received about 25,000 anti-air and 60,000 anti-tank weapons, and in terms of money the US alone gave $40 billion as of now. The foreign help also includes the approximately 20,000 foreign volunteers that went to fight in Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry warned that the volunteers are not entitled to protection under the Geneva Conventions, and captured foreign volunteers would not be considered prisoners of war, but persecuted as criminals. Foreign aid to Ukraine also came in the form of sanctions against Russia. The West imposed sanctions on banks, individuals, and businesses, and disconnected major banks from the SWIFT system. The goal is to cripple the Russian economy, which worked, as the ruble went to an all-time low, the stock market in Russia fell by 39%, and many Western companies pulled out of Russia. But Russia still has money to fund the invasion. Gas money. Russia supplies about 45% of the EU's natural gas imports. And now they demanded the EU that the payment for gas would be made in rubles. When the European states didn't comply, they were cut from Russian gas. As a result, the fuel prices in the EU went up by a lot. The war also created the biggest refugee crisis since the Yugoslav wars. Over 1 million Ukrainians left the country in the first week of the war, and the number of refugees reached 8 million, but it decreased due to many Ukrainians returning home, and now it sits at about 6 million. Poland took the most refugees, 3.3 million. Romania is in second place with 900,000, and Russia also received about 800,000. The other top destinations were Hungary, Moldova and Slovakia. Most of the refugees are women, children and elders, since men between the ages of 18 and 60 were denied to leave the country. Now let's look at the Russian incompetence. Russia had some big logistic problems in the war. There have been reports of tanking running out of fuel and having to stop their advance or even steal diesel from gas stations. Soldiers also stole food from stores since they didn't receive enough rations. There was a big lack of organization between the ground troops, air troops and the long-range firing, with a big part of the army communicating by phone or by radio, which was easily intercepted by the Ukrainians, and the list could go on. But the cherry on top is the low morale of the soldiers. Many sabotaged their equipment and deserted, and some captured soldiers said that they didn't even know that they were at war, thinking it was just a military exercise. Russia was unable to get a quick victory that was expected at the start of the war. But there is still a way that will make Ukraine surrender in no time: the use of nuclear weapons. Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, but it has not used it in Ukraine because of the international response that would follow. The use of nuclear weapons would definitely make the Western allies of Ukraine willing to get involved. And the second reason they didn't use nukes is the destruction that will cause in Ukraine. Russia doesn't want to destroy Ukraine. That's just not the goal of the war. The goal is to annex the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine and to incorporate it into Russia. So the use of nukes in Ukraine is out of the question. However, there have been threats of nuclear attacks. Putin said that if another country intervenes in the war, Russia will respond with everything they have. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, also seems to be in favor of using nukes. But I don't think we have anything to worry about, because a Russian diplomat commented on the use of nuclear weapons, saying that Russia presently has no plans on using them, unless Russian sovereignty was found to be under threat. It's pretty clear that Russia can't win right now, but the conflict has to end somehow. The other option to end the war is for Ukraine to push the Russians out, but this would require way more help from the West. Putin knows he can't get pushed out of Ukraine, because defeating Ukraine will not only humiliate the Russian army, but it will also destroy the legitimacy of the government. It's safe to say that people would be furious if Russia lost the war. So the defeat in Ukraine could actually mean the end of Putin's regime. So if Ukraine will be able to start a big offensive to push the Russians out, Putin will be ready to throw everything he has just to hold the line, which will probably result in massive casualties on both sides. This leaves us with the outcome that I personally think is the most likely, a stalemate. The negotiations between the two sides, except for opening corridors for the refugees, achieved nothing substantial. Ukraine is not willing to give up any of its territories, and Putin can't stop the invasion unless he achieves something that can be framed as a victory for the Russian public. So the only way I see this ending is in a frozen conflict with minimal combat that will last years. But what do you think about the war? Share your opinion in the comments below. And if you like this video, chances are that you will like some of my other videos, so subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and until the next time, don't forget, stay informed.